Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and finish up this chapter on the presidency. And we're going to talk about specifically the modern presidency, technology, how the president has shaped his office. Those types of things. So let's go ahead and start talking about the technology side of the presidency. The presidency, like I mentioned in the first lecture, is one of the most visible offices, not just in the United States, but also in the world. The president is commonly on TV, commonly gets the blame for things that aren't part of his control. We'll talk about that in a minute. And is just, in general, the face of everything good or bad in the country. Now, the politics of the presidency is that no matter if something is going good or bad, the president has to spin it in a manner that actually influences the public so that they can get reelected and keep their approval numbers up. Think George W. Bush and the housing market bubble in 2008. Think President Obama and the killing of bin Laden. Donald Trump and Infrastructure Week, or building the wall. Ronald Reagan and the Cold War era. All these things affect how a person sees a president. And there are things that are outside of a president's control that affect the way that citizens look at the president. Take Jimmy Carter and the Iran hostage crisis in 1978 and 9. Those are things that significantly hampered his presidency and ultimately his reelection. One of the first presidents to truly lean into the media was Theodore Roosevelt. He started kind of doing the beginning phases of where a president would interact with the media a lot. And Eisenhower actually did the first televised press conference saying that we're experimenting with something new, and I hope that this doesn't become a distraction. I wonder how he would react to our current state of media and the presidency. FDR, certainly not the first person to use the radio to speak to the citizens of the United States under his control, but very famous for his fireside chat. There's a website called the American Presidency Project that demonstrates, or actually doesn't demonstrate, but it shows transcripts of basically everything that a public president has said, or that a president has said out loud while they were president. And you can search it between, just miscellaneous remarks, things they said to Congress. You can search individual incidents. You can see how the president said things about this, that, or the other, and the presidential voice. Now, when you're talking about the election of a president, you hear the term presidential voice all the time. He doesn't look presidential. He doesn't seem presidential. He's not presidential. The thing that I like to come back to with the presidential voice is that you never get to use it unless you're elected. So how do you know you have it until you're there? I don't know. That's more of a philosophical question than anything else. But the internet, of course, changed the way the presidents interact with the public. Donald Trump being a very famous version of Twitter, using Twitter to communicate with his base at all hours. President Obama using Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as a fundraising tool for his campaign in 2008. They mobilized the internet for the very first time in a modern presidency in a way like no other president had ever never done before, and also never had the opportunity to do before. Because the internet was there during the Clinton administration, it was there during the Bush administration, but Bush and his team didn't. They were still kind of old school. They were not really moving into the new technological era as easy as the late 2010s and early 2020s with or late or the 2010s as Obama and Trump did. This has also led to a situation where the president is in front of the public a lot more, exponentially more than at any other time in history. As a result, presidential messaging has become very important, whereas before, presidents like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and Garfield, all of these presidents had to interact with their constituencies on timed appearances like the inaugural address, the State of the Union, individual battlefield dedications in Lincoln's case, Garfield speaking at the convention that ultimately got him nominated, those types of things. The president was not normally in front of the camera. And even during the election process, the most famous incident of the TV influencing a presidential election was when John F. Kennedy debated Richard Nixon on the first televised presidential debate. Those that watched TV saw a poised Kennedy and a sweaty, dumpy-looking Richard Nixon who was sweating and just kind of looked disheveled under the hot TV lights, whereas Kennedy looked poised, controlled, and perfectly manicured. And those on the radio heard Nixon being controlling, being concise, being all the things that you would want from a president. They believed that Nixon had won the debate hands down, but on the other side, on the TV side, the eye test went to Kennedy. People believed that Kennedy had won the battle of the eye test. So that's one of those things that, how the new modern presidency works from my brother-in-law. Now, going public, the president can, like today, for example, President Biden did a live set of remarks in San Francisco, I think, at the Port of San Francisco, or Port of Los Angeles. Not the Port of San Francisco doesn't have a port, I don't think, but the Port of Los Angeles. And he took his message of the supply chain is going to be okay, and his message that it's finally infrastructure week, and the big infrastructure bill that was passed last week in Congress, which is a big deal. I have some serious problems with it, but it's a big deal. It's actually delivering on promises that the president, a big part of his domestic agenda anyway. Now, going public is a two-edged sword, especially now. When you go public, you have to be very careful about how you phrase your message, because the way that you phrase it is you're trying to sell it to the American public. And if you don't hit the right tones, then the public's not going to receive the message well, and they can start to further divide the public than they already are. It could start to deepen those that are against you, further entrench those that are for you, and the independents in the middle, unless you can show them directly how it affects them, they don't care. Uh, the adage with legislation is generally that you eat sausage because it's delicious, but you never want to see how sausage is made. That is not how that phrase goes. I just butchered that, but you know what I mean. The general consensus amongst presidents in politics is that you want to keep your message private. You want to keep your cards close to your vest so that you can divulge the message as you want to and not put it out into the world so that it can be, I guess, manipulated and critiqued and all these other things. You want to just show the positive results of your negotiations, not the negotiations themselves. And I think honestly that piece of advice holds a lot of weight when you look at the way that Congress negotiated the infrastructure bill. I think that actually holds, Democrats in disarray and all those different headlines about how bad Democrats are, about how they couldn't even agree to simple things inside of their own party. Those types of things could be mitigated if you keep your message close to the vest versus trying to go public with it too soon. And it's harder to change minds after you go in public as well. We're not going to talk about the First Lady. You should read about the role of the First Lady, and if you get a chance, there's a book called, oh geez, what's the name of that book? There's two books that I want to recommend to you. One is called The President's Club, and it covers the very exclusive club of ex-presidents that are still alive. Let's see. Upstairs at the White House, My Life with the First Ladies. It covers the life of the chief usher who came into the White House at the end of the second Roosevelt administration, and stayed through, I believe, the start of Reagan, I think. Um, let's talk about presidential governance. These are the things that presidents can do. These are the things that I wanted to talk to you guys about. These are directly the things that the president can control at any given time. So in domestic policy, they have control over a lot of things. Um, Presidents nominate cabinet officials, and they can be hired through the process of the Senate. The only person that the president cannot fire in the executive branch is the vice president, who's an elected official. Uh, in every other case, the president has the power to demand or expect a resignation from a person in their cabinet. I mean, and it's generally done in a manner to cause the least amount of embarrassment to the cabinet member or to the president. Um, the president also has the power of the pardon without conditions, especially for federal crimes. Now, just because you're pardoned of a federal crime does not mean that you won't face a state crime down the line. So that's one of the things. Uh, Andrew Johnson wholesale pardoned members of the former Confederacy. Harry Truman issued 2,000 pardons and commutations. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. Carter issued pardons to draft dodgers for Vietnam. Reagan didn't use it as much. H.W. Bush didn't mention it much either. President Clinton pardoned a few people in his presidency, a few of them at the last minute that showed some controversy. I honestly don't remember who they were, and I should have looked them up beforehand. Barack Obama granted 212 pardons, or 6% of his total petitions received. President Trump ended up using his President Trump used his in a little bit more of a controversial way, pardoning certain people that probably could testify against him, um, and used it kind of as a political favor kind of tool. This isn't me saying it as somebody that doesn't like Trump. That's just the reality. He used his office to pardon his friends to shield them from legal liability so that they couldn't potentially affect him. That's, you know, let me see. Now, executive orders are probably one of the more controversial things that presidents can do in domestic policy. They direct government agencies to pursue a certain course in the absence of congressional action. Executive memorandums are the less controversial version of these. Executive orders, to me, uh, they can't. Okay, executive orders do not replace policy. Let's be clear. They do not replace congressional action. But what they can do is direct federal agencies with laws already on the books and change their interpretations as they are carried out by the executive branch to fulfill the president's vision for what it should be. I think I already said this in the first lecture, but I want to hit it again because this is something that, like the mask mandate for federal workers, that falls squarely under the president's purview with OSHA. And I actually had a person tell me that OSHA, Joe Biden shouldn't be in charge of OSHA at all. OSHA is a regulatory arm of the executive branch and therefore hated by Joe Biden. That's just reality. I don't know what else to say to that. Proclamations have force of law, but are not, you don't need any kind of congressional handholding for them. The most famous proclamation being the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, which declared slaves in areas under Confederate control to be free, because at the time, the United States did not recognize the South as an independent country. They just recognized that states were in revolt, but still part of the overall union. They did not did not acknowledge their right to total secession. So that's where a lot of the war power that Lincoln derived, and a lot of the reason for the 13th Amendment, and also for the Emancipation Proclamation came from. Which, by the way, another movie you should watch is Lincoln by Steven Spielberg. It is Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln is fantastic, and it's very emotional for me because I try to think about what it would have been like to have been in the room when they passed the 13th Amendment and what that meant for the end of hostility in the Civil War, for the end of slavery as we understood it. It was very emotional, impactful. Executive orders can also be changed by presidents. So when a president puts forth an executive order that the next president doesn't agree with, that executive order can be reversed or changed or struck from the books entirely. Usually, this is one of those things that's most controversial when a president first takes office. They take office and then immediately start undoing executive orders, and libertarians start yelling about how Congress should be the only ones that do that, and this, that, and the other. But that's what libertarians do, is they just yell at nothing. Um, um, Presidents have line item vetoes as well. Line item vetoes are a type of veto that keeps the majority of a spending bill unaltered but nullifies certain lines of spending within it. The president acquired the power in 1996 after Congress passed a law permitting it. Clinton used the tool sparingly. Let's see. Okay, so I forgot about this. The Supreme Court ended up saying that particular tool of line item vetoes for a president were illegal. I'd forgotten about that. That's my fault. I thought it was something else. And on the other hand, signing statements are statements issued by a president when agreeing to legislation that indicates how the chief executive will interpret and enforce the legislation in question. Signing statements are less powerful than vetoes. The congressional opponents complain that they derail legislative intent. Used by presidents since at least James Monroe, but they become far more common in this century, in the 21st century. Signing statements, as I understand them, again, are the interpretive arm of the presidency that basically says, hey, I'm the president. This is how I'm going to interpret this particular law. This is how it's going to be carried forth. Now, national security, foreign policy, and war. Lincoln ordering the suspension of habeas corpus. There's civilian control of the military, meaning that the commander in chief is the civilian that is in charge of the United States military. Presidents can hire and fire commanders, and they also use their power to aggressively deploy universal or United States military force, like universal. Congress very rarely takes the lead on war. The president often does that first. There are a couple of wars in particular, Korea, Vietnam. These were wars that were waged by presidents without congressional approval. FDR, after Pearl Harbor, went to Congress to ask for a formal declaration of war. The Persian Gulf conflict in 91 and in 2003 were all not official declarations of war, but under the guise of national security, they were actions taken. Now, executive agreements are with foreign powers. Formal agreements negotiated between two countries but not ratified. They are not treaties. They are cumbersome to get ratified, which, like anything that you have to fit through Congress is cumbersome. So any way that a president can get around it, they're going to do it. This is one of those ways with executive agreements. So there are agreements that require congressional power or congressional approval. Those agreements are things like things that require spending on behalf of the United States under the power of the purse and the Congress. Um, but for the most part, they do not conflict with domestic law and therefore do not require congressional approval. Now, the power of persuasion, or as Doris Kearns Goodwin called it, the bully pulpit. Presidents' rhetoric, presidents' demeanors, presidents, they have this a bit. We'll go back to the presidential voice a little bit. Presidents have to be able to stand in front of a room and justify what they're doing, not just to the Congress, but also to the American people. They have to be able to persuade the public, the Congress, their own parties, opposition parties, uh, the media. They have to use their powers of persuasion to, I guess the word is, oh, there's a word that I'm looking for and I can't find it. But they're basically trying to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what they're doing and ensure that the actions that they are taking are right for the country at large. The president generally wields most of their power behind the scenes in ways that you'll never actually publicly see. The negotiation process, carrot and stick negotiations, those types of things. You'll generally never see a president doing those things, but the presidents that get things done have the ability to persuade in a way that others do not. And it just depends on the presidency whether or not they have that gift or not. Um, so in terms of legacy and influence, presidents will take the opportunity to do things that they think are for the best of the nation. They will take opportunities and take risks that are presented to them. They will jump ahead on domestic issues as necessary to ensure that things get done in a timely manner. All these things building toward their legacies, which is how they are remembered. And that being said, I will end this lecture for this evening. Have a good night.